Welcome to another episode of Twice Told Tales podcast. Today we're going to talk to Vanessa Beeley, who doesn't need to introduce. Everyone probably knows her, and I'm going to let her tell us more about herself and her work.
Well, basically, I'm an independent investigative journalist, a freelancer. I've been living in Syria for the last 3 years and working in Syria for 7 years. Before that, I spent around a year between Egypt, Cairo, Alexandria, and Gaza. I entered Gaza the first time in 2012 through the tunnels. And after 2 days, Israel started its 2012 bombing, aggression, mowing the lawn, whatever it wants to call it, the massacre, the continued genocide of Palestinians inside Gaza. And then I went back in 2013 to Gaza with the intention of actually getting residency there and setting up a program to help kids with ADHD. But health issues kind of got in the way, so I had to come back to France for treatment. And then that's when I'd already met Eva Bartlett, who's like my best friend and my closest colleague. We actually met at the Rafah crossing into Gaza in 2012, and we've been friends ever since. And with her, I got involved in the Syria Solidarity movement, and then that kind of expanded out into my work on the ground in Syria, in Russia, in Donbass. I've obviously been to Tehran once in 2016, and hoping to come again very soon. And that's it, really. I just try to push back against my government in particular, but the kind of what I call the alliance of evil or the axis of evil, which is the US, UK, EU, Gulf states, Israel, Turkey, all the countries that have basically clubbed together to destroy the region, to break apart the alliances that exist, for example, between Syria and Iran and Syria and Russia and so on. That's how, I guess that's what I see as being my job. I don't believe people in the West should interfere. I know we've had this conversation between ourselves in an interview. I don't think the West has any right to interfere in the sovereign affairs of any nation state. And so my job is to prevent that happening, because when that happens, we have war. If everyone respected the sovereignty, the territorial integrity, the self-determination of the people of nation states, we really wouldn't be in the mess we're in now. So I guess that's my priority. I call it anti-imperialism, call it whatever you want. I tend not to call it anti-war, because I think the entire kind of anti-war movement now has become this sort of liberal mess. Pacifism for me is a Western privilege, because Western countries have no memory of what it's like to be under attack, to be under sanctions, to be blockaded, to be sieged, to be targeted for destabilization projects and clandestine military operations and regime change operations. They have no idea. And, no one here in Syria wants war. Everyone here is against war, but they believe in the right to defend themselves and defend their families, to defend their homeland, and to defend their heritage, their history, their culture, and their civilization. And so that's what I support.
But I'm here in the U.S. and I feel exactly the same way. I'm like, what I can do is push back against the government. And I think what you were saying about people being under siege, it can extend to the actual citizens of the West. Their minds are under siege. I mean,
absolutely,
the ignorance in the West is what drives these fundraising for war, these imperialist projects. And I think what you do in terms of providing actual journalistic content and reality-based reporting to people who are in these kind of I don't know, imperialist trances is really valuable. So I commend you for that. It's been really nice following your work.
People have been really gaslighted for years. They've forgotten how to actually use their own rationale and their own ability, their own agency to figure things out. Literally
doing your own research.
Yeah. Yeah, basically,
okay.
Breaking out of that mainstream media paradigm, and actually trying to understand what is going on in these different countries. And also, I always say it's kind of like Groundhog Day. They forget what happened in Libya, in Iraq. But that was Libya and Iraq. In Syria, it's different. Now it's recognized that in Syria, it was a regime change war, etc. The consensus has changed. So now I see it on China, or I see it on Iran, or I see it on Ukraine and Russia. It's the same old, same old. No one kind of steps out of the hamster wheel and goes, well, hang on a minute, didn't we hear all this same stuff in Libya, in Iraq, in Syria, from weapons of mass destruction to chemical weapons in Syria to the same old script actually in Ukraine?
No creativity.
No,
exactly.
There's none.
It's just
but I
scenario repeated and repeated
women's
over
rights
and over.
in Iran, the same as Afghanistan. What happened to women's rights in Afghanistan now?
Yeah, one of our previous guests, Hannah, said I keep bringing it up because I think it's one of the best critiques of the era we're in is that it's just so boring. Because it's just there is no creativity. We're just running the same script over and over again, and people they're just in an ignorant trance. And I don't totally discount their agency and feel that they're innocent in this. I think the internet is available. There's a lot of information. So I have trouble just kind of passively saying, these are ignorant people.
I had that discussion. Someone, I can't remember what I tweeted, but someone came on and said, I think I said something like, the US, UK are the axis of evil, blah, 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 about the recent Israeli bombing of Damascus civilian airport. And someone who was obviously American came on and said, no, our governments are, you can't say all of America or all of the UK. So my answer always is, okay, what did you do to try and stop the war against Syria? What did you do to prevent the sanctions or to protest the sanctions? Where were all the marches in the last 11 years? Where were they? No, you were all cheering for Assad to go and for Al-Qaeda to be victorious in Syria, because for at least 8 years, you didn't figure out what was going on. So I'm sorry, you're passive aggressively part of the system, and you voted in, because he was talking about, no, I voted for change. So I said, you're telling me you voted for Trump? Well, Trump thermal ballooned all of the agricultural crops in the Northeast. He made it clear he was there to steal Syrian oil. He bombed Syria after, the fake chemical attack in Khan Sheikhoun in 2017. He assassinated Soleimani and Muhandis, the two military leaders that were responsible for the defeat of ISIS in Syria and in Iraq, of course, with their allies on the ground. So, you voted for change. What is the change? And Trump introduced the most aggressive economic sanctions against Syria under the Caesar law, which also punishes, which is completely unlawful, punishes any country, any sovereign nation that comes to the aid of Syria. That's unheard of.
Yeah, well, I'm willing to give the working class a pass on those things because, they're busy and they're already stressed enough. But the weird thing is in the last couple years, the working class is actually one of the most knowledgeable of the scams than the academia and the intelligentsia, which is so annoying to me. And so if you're looking at, the cowardice in the journalistic and in academic classes is really unbelievable.
Well, they've been heavily infiltrated also. Academia in the UK is I mean, you had the case of Professor David Miller, who was effectively dismissed, even though he won his case against the claims that he was spreading anti-Semitic propaganda, blah, blah, blah. So, but academia in the UK has been infiltrated for a very, very long time. Intelligence agencies have control of academia, of the media, of the political sphere, of UN agencies, NGO complex, the whole billionaire complex.
And the proof is they eagerly gobbled up an experimental injection, which we still don't even know what's in it. And they're just like, yeah, give me more. And what? Like, aren't you critical thinkers? It's just unbelievable.
And I think, probably the reason the working class are the ones that are seeing through what's going on, particularly in Syria. And I would say the various factions of Communist Party in the UK in particular were very good at seeing through the lies from very early on. It's because they are hugely under attack also, of course, with the COVID project, with the WEF, with the eugenicist programs that are coming out now in Canada particularly, but have existed for centuries in the UK. I'm just looking into that at the moment. I mean, it's terrifying.
I mean, they're straight up euthanizing poor people and mentally handicapped people. It's unbelievable.
And kids, babies up to 1 year old now. They're recommending to be put onto the assisted suicide program.
Unbelievable.
It's just this is the debauchery of the West. Also, this is something. That's why I said to you in the beginning, it's much easier to live in Syria, not only because, in a sense, you're on the front lines, but because people here in Iran, in Russia, from different perspectives, but they've maintained their traditions, their religious roots, their spirituality, their history, their culture, their civilization. They've not allowed it to tip over into the kind of, I call it the Dante's Inferno abyss, because that's literally where the West is right now. It's on all the 7 levels.
Yep.
And that's also an indication of the end of empire, by the way. I mean, every empire that's dying goes through this kind of depravity and distortion and pure evil, actually. And we don't have statesmen anymore in the West. We have idiots. We have people that are just put in place to carry through the decisions of the oligarchy. They're not statespeople. They're not decision makers. They're not educated even. They're liars.
Trump is an example.
Yeah. And they're all, there's no difference between them because they're actually not in charge of the roadmap. They're directing specific elements of that roadmap, and they're being told how to direct it from above, but they're not in charge of it. And that's become more and more apparent in the last 2 or 3 years.
So Tara's right. Trump is a good example, but the interesting thing about Trump is that he is actually more valuable in controlling the liberals than he is in executing a conservative plan. Like, he's been the best mind game, and people, like, everyone just can't stop talking about him. Even he hasn't been in office forever, he's still like, Trump, Trump, Trump. It's like their entire brain has been taken over by this phenomenon, and now they are just supporting crazy wars in Ukraine, which is, causing massive inflation, taking money out of the U.S. that could be used for better things. And then now we're under literal threat of nuclear bombardment because of to save a country that even liberals can't find on a map. So it's like...
it's not only that. Ukraine is a failed state. Zelensky has sold off the majority of its real estate and its land. It's been the money laundering center for the US and the UK and the EU for years. I mean, it's I said it on Twitter, actually. I said, I can't believe I'm having to argue that Nazis are bad. I mean, really, that's where we've arrived at. That's the point we've arrived at. I thought it was bad that I had to explain Al-Qaeda were not good. right? But now I'm actually having to argue, no, Nazis are bad. They're really bad. Stop inviting them into your universities. Stop giving them a platform. Stop normalizing them.
And mainstream media was jaw-dropping about Nazis in Ukraine up until the beginning of 2019. Yeah. And like alternative media was talking about Israel funding the Azov battalion in Ukraine as late as, I think as early as like 2018. There were stories about that. So it's like, this is nothing new. This isn't a conspiracy. And if it is, it's a really long game on the part of the, alternative media to talk about this, because how could they have predicted this war? I mean, I don't know. It's amazing what backpedaling and confusion propaganda they'll come up with to make people think that they're gaslighting, make people think what they see isn't true. But
and also, I mean, it's recently Israel itself welcomed an Azov battalion soldier to Israel. I mean, quite extraordinary, This guy's a Nazi and he's being platformed, but it's not actually so surprising, because when you look at the collaboration historically between Zionism and Nazism, if you take out the religious aspect, if you take out the Judaism, what is Zionism? It's an ultra-nationalist, racist, elitist organization, right? And in the 1920s, Jabotinsky, who is actually the kind of the spiritual mentor of Benjamin Netanyahu, by the way, who is a revisionist Zionist and whose grandfather was a supporter of Jabotinsky. Jabotinsky formed a collaboration with Simon Petlura, the first president of Ukraine, who had carried out multiple pogroms against Jews and communists. But why? Because this was perceived to be a collaboration against the threat of Russian aggression, right? So the Jews under Jabotinsky were allowed to form their own militia and were allowed to form their own police forces and security forces and so on the basis that if they both faced the threat of a Russian aggression, they would collaborate. So this collaboration goes way back, way before even the Zionist movement really came into full swing.
But there's a deep-seated anti-Russian, like, it's almost the core of the neocons, and people don't recognize that. They think neocons are just like anti-Palestinian or whatever. That's a very basic understanding of what neocons are. They're an anti-Russian force, and so.
It's not only anti-Russian, it's actually boils down to being anti-communist. I mean, you have to remember that when the Nazis started their pogroms, they started first with the communists, actually, and then went to the Jews. And if you look at organizations like Victims of Communism that are now pretty much directing traffic against China, so they're directing the propaganda against China, they were established by Nazis.
Yeah.
Lev Dobryansky, who was the founder of VOC, Victims of Communism, which, as I said, is one of the kind of State Department funded and backed organizations that's running, for example, the Uyghur propaganda against China. Lev Dobryansky, who actually established it with Zbigniew Brzezinski, was a Nazi who was imported from Ukraine. And even in Canada, the majority of Nazis that came into Canada, or even Ukrainians that came into Canada, were Nazis, were ultra-nationalists. So Freeland, her grandfather was basically publishing Goebbels' propaganda in Ukraine. She worked for a Banderite media outlet too, actually, in Ukraine. So she has Nazi origins, right? And that's the thing. All of these Nazi elements were embedded. I mean, you know that the U.S. brought in Nazi war criminals to establish the MK Ultra thought control program, etc., at Fort Derrick and so on. And I can't remember his name, but there was a Japanese war criminal that was also brought in to develop the chemical weapons, bioweapons capability for the CIA.
Operation Paperclip
has written a really good book on this, actually.
Isn't that Paperclip?
Poisoner. Yeah, Operation Paperclip. But Stephen Kinz's book is called The Chief poisoner, and it's about Sidney Gottlieb, who was this Nazi who was brought in to develop basically the whole kind of MK Ultra mind control program and so on. So Western society has been completely infiltrated deliberately by Nazis since the end of World War II. So the fact that they are now extolling the virtues of Nazism shouldn't be any surprise. It's just what I find scary is that I'm having to persuade people it's a bad thing.
Well, what's scary is these are people that just a year ago or whatever were screaming about anti-racism, and it's like this is the thing that's frustrating. Of course, Nazis have existed or whatever, but you have a whole class of people in the Western world that just has no brain. They just go with whatever mainstream media says, and they'll go from one thing to the complete opposite thing the next day, and it's just so frustrating. They go from like, oh, you're my body, my choice, women's rights. The next day, you gotta inject this experimental thing that nobody knows what it is, and then they'll go from like, oh, Black Lives Matter, anti-racism, to being like, yay, Nazis. It's like, what? Like, what are we dealing with?
You know, they'll all put the Ukrainian flag as their avatar, and suddenly Russians are orcs, and Russians can be completely wiped out because they're dehumanized.
Well, there's a guy just 5 houses down.
Iranians, that's what they did with Syrians, that's what they did with Libyans, that's what they did with Iraqis, Yemenis, Venezuelans.
And with Iran.
There's a guy 5 houses down from here who has out in front of his house like a big flag. The first half is the U.S. flag, and then it fades into the Ukrainian flag. And nobody takes offense to that? I mean, how is that not offensive? If I was a U.S. serviceman, I would go to that, knock on that guy's door and say, you have to take this down. Because that's like equating the U.S. with Ukraine. I mean, as much as the U.S. is it does horrible things around the world or whatever, if you're a patriot and you're going to hang a U.S. flag, at least be consistent with that. You can't, I mean, it's just... sorry.
I'd be so inclined to paint a swastika over it, but
exactly. I'm inclined to just hang a swastika outside and see if I could get some action, and then I'll just point to that guy and say, what? I thought it was normal.
Yeah.
Yeah, so because we don't have that much time, I want to talk about the assassination of General Soleimani and Abu Muhandis. Like, I know that, I mean, there is so much that we want to talk about with you, and it's very informative for me, and I learned a lot. But let's talk about the assassination of let's talk about the role of General Soleimani and Abu Mahdi and Muhandis, and the role they played in the region in terms of fighting ISIS and saving the region from foreign intervention, and just supporting the resistance groups both in Iraq and in Syria and Lebanon and in Palestine.
Yeah, I mean, I met Abu Mahdi Muhandis in 2017 with a press delegation. We'd gone for a conference in Baghdad. And it just happened that he said, okay, I've got a couple of hours, bring them in. It was in the middle of all the battles against ISIS at the time. And, you know, we were incredibly privileged to meet him. And, you know, it's such an incredible guy. I mean, so warm, so intelligent. He was, I think, an engineer by trade, not a soldier. And in fact, his engineering background is what made him this great architect of resistance, you know, and this incredible breadth of humanity. You know, these people are always described, whether it's Soleimani, whether it's Muhandis, you know, of course they're dismissed as terrorists by the West. They're designated terrorists because they are effectively the nemesis of the axis of evil, the actual terrorist producers. So of course they're going to project, just as Israel does against the Palestinians, they're going to project onto them their own terrorist ideology. But when you meet these people, when you're privileged enough to meet these people, and you realize that, of course, they're not ordinary people, they're extraordinary people. But they're ordinary people that have taken on an extraordinary role, and they've maintained their ordinary connection to humanity. I think that's the best way that I can describe it. They can relate to everyone that they speak to with humor, with compassion, with understanding. I mean, it's kind of a funny story. There was one AP journalist that managed to, I have no idea how, she managed to sneak her way onto the delegation. And she had clearly been tasked with writing a hit piece on Muhandis and on Hashid al-Shabi. So she kept asking the same question in different ways to try and get him to give her a quote that she could basically fit into the byline, you know? That's how they work. They don't go there with an open mind. They go there with a story already that they need to write, and they just wait to try and trick you into giving the quotes. But he knew exactly what was going on. He was laughing at her. You know, he was teasing her. He was just like, no, I'm not going to say what you want me to say. You know? And in the end, she wrote the story and she just made stuff up. And
Wow.
but the problem was there were, I don't know how many of us, around 15 of us, including me, Pepe Escobar, Shamin Nawani. So we all just jumped on her when she produced this article and just said, you're lying. Like, he didn't say that. I had the whole transcript of the conversation. And, you know, when you look at what Hashid al-Shabi achieved in the war against ISIS, and as Muhandis said, the Americans didn't offer a single bullet to any of the resistance against ISIS. So, of course, that
ISIS.
Yeah, of course. They sold it to ISIS, you know, and they recruited and trained ISIS in Iraq and Syria. And the other thing that I think for me is the most important point about both military commanders is the lack of sectarianism. You know, even within Hashid al-Shabi, there were Yazidis, there were Sunni, there were Christians, there were every single minority sect in Iraq was included. In Syria, for example, Qasem Soleimani was hugely responsible for enabling the national defense forces of some of the Christian towns that were the most under threat. In northern Hama, for example, Mahdi, Skelbiye, both Orthodox Christian, so strong connections to Russia. And Russia later came in and also enabled the national defense forces there, because the army at one point was on something ridiculous, like more than 100 fronts, right? So there were some fronts that were left to a large degree undefended. So Soleimani, I know, was working with the Christian communities in these towns to develop the national defense and enable them to defend themselves, right? And you know, and again, Hezbollah, which of course has connections to Soleimani, to Iran, to etc. They also, in 2016, I visited the Christian town of Al-Qa on the border between Lebanon and Syria, shortly after it was attacked by, I can't remember, I think it was 8 suicide bombers in one day. And basically, Hezbollah were the core of protection in that town, in a Christian town. And the same in Malula, for example, in Syria. Hezbollah were instrumental in the liberation of Malula from Nusra Front and Free Syrian Army. So, you know, when the West is talking about these leaders as being sectarian, as being Iranian-backed supremacists, or, you know, expanding Iranian power, the reality is they were restoring stability to sovereign nations. And that's why, of course, for the West, they were an anathema, because they don't want stability in these nations. They want instability so that they can plunder resources, they can regime change, they can control all aspects of political processes in those countries.
It was kind of shocking how, like, after the red line thing that Obama did, and the whole, like, basically America was just like, no more, we're not doing another Iraq. Everyone voted against that. Then all of a sudden ISIS pops up, and it's just like this thing. Oh, well, look, we have to fight terrorism, and then we go fight ISIS instead of Damascus, and somehow
but they
that's
don't fight ISIS.
I know they don't fight.
Kerry
I meant
admitted,
fight.
yeah, exactly. I mean, this is the thing. Soleimani, of course, alongside the Syrian Arab Army and Hezbollah, and in 2015, Russia came into the fight. And then you started to really see the diminishment of ISIS, but under US battling ISIS, it was flourishing. As it is now. Look in the northeast of Syria now, there's more than 53,000 ISIS members, right? Whether it's their families or fighters, there's 53,000 in holding camps in the northeast.
How many ISIS attacks on US, like, occupied oil infrastructure have you heard? Zero. How easy would it be to do? Pretty easy. Like
None at all. And the US ferries them backwards and forwards from the holding camps into Iraq for extra training, or providing them weapons and equipment, or they ferry them to areas in the Syrian desert to the east of Homs to carry out operations against Syrian Arab Army and Russian positions and so on. And go on.
Yeah. And the injured ISIS fighters were treated in Israeli hospitals. Like, that tells also.
And also I think it was 2 years ago that the Minister of Defense, the Israeli Minister of Defense, actually admitted that they'd been providing weapons to the terrorist groups inside Syria. And the thing is that I don't make any big differentiation between Al-Qaeda and ISIS, other than perhaps the funding they receive. I see them all as a bunch of mafia groups that fight amongst themselves for territory, for power, for status, for money, for corruption, for organ trafficking, for all of these, heinous crimes that they commit. But ultimately, they're all proxies of the US cartel, and that includes Israel, of course. If it was a choice between President Assad and Iran and Hezbollah and Russia, then Israel would choose ISIS.
Well, if you just replace the misused Islam in ISIS and you replace it with a misused Judaism, you just get Israel.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
That's the same.
Yeah,
Zionism
pretty
is
much.
that. Yeah.
And if you look at who actually created what I describe as these supremacist, ultra-nationalist, racist, elitist branches of various religions, it's Britain. Britain was responsible for the creation of Ikhwan in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood. It was largely responsible for the creation and the settlement of Zionism in Palestine. It was hugely, and Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia. And now Nazism, all these four branches are very similar in ideology, and that's why nobody should be very shocked that Zelensky is, or even Kolomoisky, who established Zelensky and also established the Azov battalion, has an Israeli passport.
Wow, I didn't know that. Wow.
No one should be surprised by that. Yeah, he has dual nationality.
Okay, well.
So what do you think has happened to the resistance forces and the resistance movement after the assassination of these two generals?
I always remember, actually, after the assassination and going into Mesde, the central autostrad in Damascus, and seeing the whole strad lined with images of Soleimani, that it still brings tears to my eyes now, and they're still there. And the number of people that were going to give their condolences, and again, from all sectors of Syrian society, whether it was Christian, whether it was Druze, it didn't matter. You know, the respect for this one man and his role in really masterminding a lot of the resistance, equally in Yemen, of course. I think it hardened the resolve. I think once the shock and the loss had sunk in, then it hardened the resolve of the resistance. And actually, I think almost what we've seen since is Soleimani and Muhandis' legacy, which is the unity of the resistance. I mean, we know that in Syria was betrayed by Hamas. It was betrayed by the Muslim Brotherhood, right? But for Soleimani, and I know for Iran, the most important thing is that the resistance be unified. So what did we see recently? We saw Hamas come to Damascus to speak with President Assad. And I have to say, this was a very bitter pill for a lot of Syrians to swallow, because Hamas was really responsible for a lot of the devastation in Syria. But there is a bigger issue, there's a bigger cause. And I think that's the seed that Soleimani planted.
Can you elaborate on the Hamas, how Hamas was responsible for that? Because I think a lot of people won't understand the details.
Hamas is effectively Muslim Brotherhood. And Hamas, I'll give you an example. I was in Gaza in 2013, and I don't know if you remember, in April 2013, there was a massive explosion in Damascus, and Israel had targeted, it claimed, a Hezbollah ammunition dump, but it was literally like a nuclear explosion. It was a huge mushroom cloud explosion. And as I was in Gaza, I thought, okay, I'll interview someone from Hamas, a relatively high-up spokesperson. And I remember saying to him, well, you know, what is Hamas's response to the Israeli attack? And when he said to me, well, it's normal, they crossed Israel's red line by supplying weapons to Hezbollah, my jaw like just hit the table. I was just like, what? But at this point, you've got to realize that Hamas was taking money from Qatar and Saudi Arabia, right? It had basically pivoted away from the real resistance axis, Hezbollah, Iran, Syria, towards Saudi Arabia and Qatar. And Qatar, of course, is one of the primary funders and supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood. And Qatar put, I don't know how many billions into the war against the Syrian presidency, right? And supported Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda was funded by Qatar. And so Hamas's role in Syria was to support Al-Qaeda. So actually, even prior to 2011, Hamas had been digging the tunnels that were then used by Al-Qaeda to run the war from the suburbs of Damascus, of Aleppo, of Homs, and so on against the Syrian Arab army.
They brought the tunnel diggers.
They were training Nusra Front in the Kalamun Mountains.
Wow, I didn't know that actually. That's
and they took that technology, by the way, from Hezbollah.
Wow.
Hezbollah taught them how to make tunnels, because that was how they resisted and how they survived in Gaza all these years.
And do you think that was done like through Western intelligence using Qatar as a way of sort of like?
Sure, yeah, sure.
Like,
but also the Muslim Brotherhood has always been the favored tool of imperialism, because it was created by the imperialists, and it's perceived as, you know, the political arm of Islam, Sunni Islam. But in reality, as a friend of mine in London says, they're terrorists in suits.
That's interesting. Well, anyone who's followed the Palestine and appreciated Al Jazeera's coverage of that situation, and also is anti-imperialist and anti-war, knows distinctly the time period where this occurred, because the coverage of Syria was just jaw-dropping and absurd, and most people, I think, stopped watching it at that point. But
yeah, and you know, just for example, I don't know if you remember all of the outrage about Yarmouk camp, which was effectively it. You know, everyone uses this word camp. It was a suburb. It was a suburb of Damascus. So it was buildings where Palestinian refugees from the Nakba in 1948 shared the suburb with Syrians and of again, all different communities and sects and minorities. It was actually Hamas who worked with Nusra Front and the Free Syrian Army to allow them into Yarmouk camp and to take control.
Wow. That's
and this
really
is
sad.
all documented, by the way. I mean, Shamin Nawani actually went to all the refugee camps and spoke to the people there, and they told her, well, actually, you know, it was Hamas that opened the door to them. Right?
Well, that explains a lot
the
of the
Muslim Brotherhood, really.
fractioning of the Palestinian sort of expatriate community and as a whole over Syria. Like, it's
absolutely.
Wow. Yeah.
But also the flip side is Liwa al-Quds, which is one of the most well-known brigades of the Syrian Arab Army, is all Palestinian. And when East Aleppo was liberated, it was predominantly Liwa al-Quds that liberated this area, hugely helped by Iran, by the way, and by Russia at that point. But it was Liwa al-Quds, the Palestinian brigade. So there was the split again. You know, everyone. The thing is, what it was weaponized against Syria, to turn the Palestinian movement against Syria. And actually, what we tried to do as the Syria Solidarity Movement was we raised a petition from all the Palestinian faith leaders, whether they were Christian, whether it didn't matter. And we got hundreds, if not, I think, more than 1,000 signatures in solidarity with Syria. But the Muslim Brotherhood was such an important element within the Palestine movement. That was the problem. And so it controlled the narrative against Syria, and it deceived actually a lot of anti-imperialists, like Grey Zone. Grey Zone for 5 years supported the rebels against Assad.
And
then suddenly realized that
abrupt U-turn. Yeah.
Yeah, you know,
I think
but because they were so, let's say, they were such an important part of the Palestine movement, of course, they were deeply affected by the Muslim Brotherhood narrative and the Muslim Brotherhood power in the United States. Most of the Muslim movements and charities and NGOs and so on are Muslim Brotherhood in the States. Things like Syrian American Medical Society, Muslim Brotherhood. Only, you know, they were the only people that Democracy Now! Would interview, for example, were Muslim Brotherhood.
Well, that really cleared. I'm glad you talked about that. That cleared up a lot of because I've always been confused about what happened there. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's where, you know, Soleimani's and even Muhandis, their legacy was this unity of the resistance, because without unity, you know, what the West always tries to do is to fracture along sectarian lines the resistance. And to some degree, they've been successful. So for Soleimani and Muhandis, and for people that really understood the resistance, they realized that, okay, you know, we have to, at some point, be united in the war against Israel, the war against the West. And so that, I think, for me, I don't know whether Marwa agreed when she was on, that for me is the legacy. After Hamas came to Damascus, suddenly we started to see Syrian flags flying in Jenin and Nablus. We hadn't seen that before. Wow. You know, when there was the extended Zionist attack against Jenin and these various areas, we started to see Syrian flags flying alongside the Palestinian flags. So that for me was some kind of message, you know.
Yeah. So you think? I mean, we all will hope that this unity that has started will remain in place. But it's also, I think that maybe over time, uh, I mean, a lot of people started to understand or like what actually was happening in Syria, because as you said, the narrative on the other side, and always calling like the Assad regime as whatever they call, it was very strong, and even I saw even people inside, for example, Iran, that will fall for that narrative. But it looks like a lot of I know a lot of people who started to understand what actually was happening in Syria, and it's great that you explained, because it was difficult to understand what actually was happening and why so many people were falling for that narrative.
And
Yeah, that's
Turkey, of
great.
course, Turkey had big influence over the Muslim Brotherhood and still does. So all of these elements, you had Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, all of them really funding and influencing the Muslim Brotherhood. And of course, historically, from 1946 onwards, I wrote about the 75-year war against Syria. And the Muslim Brotherhood was consistently weaponized against whichever regime or government they wanted to remove, particularly, of course, Hafiz al-Assad in the late 70s. That, again, was a repeat of what happened in 2011. It was described as a brutal crackdown against the rebels, even back then. But the reality and the context was the savagery of the Muslim Brotherhood against Syrian people, the carrying out of suicide bombing, the assassination of the cadets in the Aleppo military college before 1982, when Hafiz al-Assad finally kind of corralled them all in Hamar, and there was, to some degree, a savage crackdown, but only after they carried out years of isolated assassinations and suicide bombings and attacks on the Syrian Arab Army, attacks on the various infidel, sects as they see them inside Syria. Again, this very sectarian ideology is very, very prevalent in the Muslim Brotherhood, and that is what was being fueled, funded, armed, and equipped by various states, including Turkey, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia. But yes, of course, behind it all is the deep state in the US and the UK. The UK, for me, is the brain of all of these operations. The US is the muscle, it's the brawn, but the UK is the intelligence.
Well, that is very interesting. I know you have to go, so I guess we'll wrap it up there. But hopefully, this can be a part 1 to a part 2. I'd love to talk to you about life in Syria and how the Syrian people view the current, occupation by the U.S. And your dogs. I've heard you have. So next time it can be a dog-friendly podcast if they're inside.
They're all fast asleep at the moment. I
that's right.
It's easy. Them out.
All right. Well, we're looking forward to chatting with you again, because there's so many interesting things that you can teach us, and I really appreciate you laying out that the intricacies of the situation. So,
thank you.
So Tara, is there anything else you want to say?
No, I'm going to wrap up this episode. So thanks for watching another episode of Twice Told Tales podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so that you get notified of the new posts.